The honor of taking this stage represents a culmination of events that I will always reflect on as a capstone to the first half of my life. Because when I graduated last May, the previous 3 years that it took to reach that point were all part of a rebuilding process in which I worked a series of hard manual labor jobs while starting a family. So, unlike most of the graduates in the class of 2020, who I imagine were disappointed by the news that in-person graduations would need to be canceled due to the pandemic, when I got my degree in the mail, held it in my hands, and posted a picture of it to social media, all I felt was a tremendous shower of relief. See, I was born into a family of educators and knew by the time I started school that I was expected to earn a college degree. My grandfather was the principal of the elementary school that I attended. My favorite aunt had a long career as principal, and my sister is currently carrying on this family tradition. So, after graduating high school, I followed in the footsteps of several family members and was accepted at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, where I completed 2 years of enrollment. But ultimately, my goal of obtaining a college degree was derailed, and before I became a college graduate, I survived a total of 12 years, 9 months, and 6 days of time in prison, which is exactly 85% of a 15-year sentence that I got for my participation in the robbery in 2003. Fortunately, no one was physically hurt during the commission of the crimes that I was convicted and sentenced for, but the psychological trauma that I caused to the victims in my case and to myself cannot be quantified. But in the last 18 months of my sentence, I got lucky when the state shackled me in chains, my wrists to my ankles and around my waist, and shipped me to the Missouri Eastern Correctional Center. Initially, I only considered the transfer to MECC a stroke of luck because it's close to St. Louis, because to that point, I had mostly been caged in places that were a minimum of 2 hours away from home. This made it harder for me to get visits from the few people who were willing to make the drive. At any rate, after I got there, I found out that WashU had recently established a prison education project. PEP is a higher education in prison program that offers credit-bearing courses and a degree program to both the staff and the people who are locked up. Obtaining access to such a high-quality higher education opportunity prior to and immediately after my release not only saved my life, but also made it possible for me to rebuild it. In the first decade of my sentence, I accumulated over a dozen certificates for taking classes offered by the state. But I knew that PEP would be completely different because those classes aren't likely to be leveraged for anything after release. And even the Missouri Parole Board knows that in some instances, they could be bought on the yard for cigarettes or stamps. I know this because they suggested I might have gotten some of mine like that during my first parole hearing. In any case, because I grew up in St. Louis, right off the bat, I was profoundly aware of the value of an education from WashU. But I had no idea how few programs like PEP exist throughout the country. In fact, it is a major understatement to say that I was lucky to have access to such an opportunity. Although a lot of people know that the American criminal legal system cages far more people than anywhere else in the world or at any other point in human history, most people don't know that severely limited access to higher education for people in prison reinforces mass incarceration. According to the Department of Justice, at least 95% of people in state prisons will be released at some point, and more than 80% get out with time left to serve on parole. But most people go back to prison within the first 3 years after release. I completed 18 months of parole and recently celebrated 4 years of release without being rearrested for anything. I'm a tax-paying citizen whose lived experiences empower me to offer informed perspectives on the issue of why so many people go back to prison. And to be clear, perspectives informed by lived experience are the most credible source of research data on this topic. That said, it is important for me to explain that the language I use and encourage others to use in referring to people who have been to prison is an effort intended to humanize us. So the reason why I say formerly caged instead of formerly incarcerated is because I want to visually and graphically contextualize for those who are fortunate not to have this experience, the act of putting people in cages as the default response to society's social problems. So I never use words like inmate, offender, prisoner, or convict, because I know that those labels have harmful consequences that punish people long after their time has been served. There are 2.3 million people in America who are held in more than 7,000 prisons, jails, or so-called correctional facilities. In stark contrast, there are only 300 higher education and prison programs. A higher education and prison program is defined as one that provides post-secondary education, is formally affiliated with a college or university, and stipulates a high school diploma or a GED as a requirement for admission. Now, of the 300 programs in existence, there are approximately 25,081 students enrolled, although student enrollment has likely declined considerably since the publication of these findings in 2020, as the number of people who are dying in prison from COVID increases daily. What this data tells us, though, is that only about 1% of the 2.3 million people who are caged in America have access to higher education. These statistics are even more severe in Missouri, where 859 out of every 100,000 people are locked up. This rate of incarceration is well above the national average of 698 out of every 100,000 people. In Missouri, where there are more than 52,000 people in custody or on supervised release, there are only 55 students enrolled in 2 programs, which means that the percentage of access here is roughly 0.1%. Given this percentage, I bet that it doesn't come as a surprise that without my participation in PEP, I wouldn't be here today. Because instead of access to high quality higher education or platforms like this, people returning to society typically become entangled in a web of legal and institutional barriers that we are ill prepared to navigate. In Missouri alone, there are 684 collateral consequences laws that restrict people with criminal convictions from participating fully in society and cast us, often permanently, to just exist in the margins. The right to vote, access to education, employment, and housing are just a few of the challenges that people face after release from prison. According to the Prison Policy Initiative, formerly caged people are 5 times more likely to be without work than the general public, 10 times more likely to experience homelessness, and 5 times more likely to be without a high school diploma. These factors help to explain increasingly high rates of recidivism, which is people going back to prison after being released. And contrary to popular belief, caging people doesn't deter crime or improve public safety. In fact, the punishment system in our country is clearly ineffective at improving public safety, and we must try something different. I believe strongly that restorative alternatives to the current model of caging as many people as possible are critical to building a more just and equitable society. A recent study by the Rand Corporation found that obtaining a higher education reduced recidivism by 43% and is 4 to 5 times less costly than reincarcerating people. As such, an expansion of higher education and prison programs, specifically ones that prioritize reentry pathways that lead students to the traditional campuses that sponsor them, will alleviate taxpayers of some of the cost burdens of just shipping people back to prison. Additionally, it will provide folks who are in prison with the necessary tools and networks of support to make positive contributions to society when they get out. Because the hard reality is that time served is insufficient compensation for the debts we are told we must pay back to society. Years of unproductive time in isolation and a diet that includes food that is literally labeled not fit for human consumption are all largely unimportant after release, which is when the process of rehabilitation really begins. It is not possible for people who have been to prison to make amends to anyone in society impacted by their offense until they are released. And the idea that prison actually rehabilitates anyone is frankly ridiculous. From my vantage point, caging people is intended to break the human spirit, chiefly by ignoring the root causes of what leads people to prison to begin with, and by cutting off all community and familiar connections. None of this positions people who have caused harm to make amends or those who have been harmed to be healed. With this in mind, although the acceptance of formerly caged people into campus communities has the capacity to elevate and to transform lives, it must be reinforced with community buy-in. Collective efforts to establish new social standards that are centered in principles of restorative justice and harm reduction can bring about real and lasting social change. But as the events of the past year in the global fight for racial and social justice has made crystal clear, efforts to effect real change will be met with violent resistance. Even so, we must remain steadfast in all movements to do away with systems that foster harm rather than healing and that compound the challenges that people face after being released from prison. Now, to this point, I have only talked about some of the barriers that returning citizens face after release and have yet to disclose any of the personal challenges that I confronted in my own reentry. The reason that I took this approach is that my goal has been to convince you that greater access to higher education for all is vastly more important than one formerly caged person or the 1% of the entire prison population currently being granted access. So now that you know my message is much broader than how I've been personally impacted, I want to explain what I mean when I say that access to high quality higher education saved my life. 9 months before I was released from prison on March 23rd, 2017, my younger brother was arrested and charged with accessory to murder. We have an older brother who was already doing a life sentence. So when my younger brother got sentenced to life without imprisonment plus 100 years, our family was even more devastated than when I got locked up. My mother has suffered 2 debilitating strokes since I've been home and now has to live in a nursing facility. Additionally, I have struggled to repair more fractured relationships than I can count. Suffice it to say that my social and emotional development took a major hit over the course of nearly 13 years in a concrete box. But since my release, I've become a father to 2 children who have given my life greater purpose. In retrospect, I endured each of the personal challenges that I confronted simply because I recognized the value of the opportunity that I had. See, I knew that my acceptance into this campus community was an opportunity that a lot of people might have thought that I shouldn't have. And I needed to prove to myself and to any naysayers that I was worthy of it. Plus, I knew that if I dropped the ball, others might not get the same opportunity that I did. And this was a huge motivator in the journey to graduation because for me, it was legitimately a second chance, as I was enrolled in college when I got locked up. But most people in prison have never received a first chance to access higher education. However, I understand that no matter how convincingly I present my argument, there will still be some people who cannot be convinced that mass incarceration is a humanitarian crisis in the same way that I do. And there's no way that I could produce a valid argument to deny that I am biased on the issue. But I genuinely appreciate conversations with naysayers the most because they give me opportunities to correct distorted and mostly fear-based perspectives. See, I found that even if people are woke to the social, economic, and political impacts of mass incarceration, many still just aren't open to equitable access to higher education for people in prison as a solution to it. But because my undergraduate education has armed me with dozens of resources to reference in waking people up, the conversations that I have with naysayers are fluid and easy. See, I direct them to resources like the 2018 Equity Indicators Report, which was published by the St. Louis City Mayor's Office, and says that of the 10,000 vacant properties in the city, more than 90% are on the north side where I grew up. I explain how the crumbling housing stock is the result of the city's long and prominent local history of racial discrimination in housing policy and practice. Oh, I'm quick to name drop a study by the WashU Medical School, which highlights several North St. Louis zip codes that have some of the highest rates of childhood asthma in the country. I explained how communities where poverty and disadvantage are so deliberately concentrated like this inevitably lead people to prison. Lately, I've been especially delighted to tell folks that the restriction of Pell Grants for people in prison has been lifted, which means that, like it or not, more people like me will soon be granted access to higher education. To folks who seem to bristle at this news, I try to explain that more often than not, The reasons why kids who are growing up in the neighborhoods like the ones that I did are more likely to end up in prison or dead than we are to access higher education have very little to do with our academic abilities. Look, there is no doubt in my mind that being a part of this campus community shielded me from many of the barriers that returning citizens are held up by. And because I am keenly aware of the social benefits afforded to me by my membership, for the past several years, on any given day, I can be spotted rocking a WashU t-shirt. I can legit wear a different WashU t-shirt for a week straight. But I have to admit that only a fraction of this is about school pride. See, for me, a WashU t-shirt is like body armor, but don't get it twisted. I'm under no illusions that my t-shirts have the power to shield me from the social impacts of being Black and formerly caged. I know that they don't because I grew up right here in St. Louis, where the local police department killed more people than any other department in the country between 2013 and 2020. And a recent study reported that being Black in Missouri means that I am at least 15 times more likely to be gunned down by a cop than a white person. Still, I'm convinced that when people see my Black skin in those t-shirts, they convince themselves that I'm not as much of a threat as their implicit biases tell them that I am. Since September of last year, my educational privilege and the connections that it has afforded allow me to work to end the injustice of money bail in Nashville, Tennessee, where I'm employed as a coordinator for the Nashville Community Bail Fund, a nonprofit organization that works to free people who are detained pre-trial without convictions simply because they do not have money to pay for bail. Additionally, I am privileged to work closely with an organization called Choosing Justice Initiative that works to standardize high-quality legal representation for poor people and strives to end wealth-based disparities in the criminal legal system. I am also studying to take the law school admissions test and plan to apply for enrollment into law school in the fall of 2022. Considering the mountain of challenges that formerly caged people encounter upon release from prison, determination and commitment alone would not have been sufficient to reach this point. I am a formerly caged person. I am a WashU graduate. I am an agent for transformative change. I am Jameel Spann. Thank you for listening.